What's up, ego hackers? Welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph, and today we're going to be talking about a tragedy in terms of masculine feminine relationships, sexuality, marriage, and how subconscious development is such a problem in the West and has remained such a problem for such a long time, that what it's basically done and its development throughout the 1900s and where we're at today in the 21st century. So the main theme of this episode, though, is actually all about war and how war changes men and how those changes in men end up leading to changes in their relationships at home. So, what's interesting to note is that war is literally what separates the men from the boys. It's also the kind of thing in the world that actually creates UD men the fastest, more than anything else. Because, war, men don't have a choice. They do have to fight. They will fight. Society will basically sell them downriver, take away all of their little safety nets, and force them onto the battlefield where they will die, basically. And war ends up creating a survival of the fittest situation. War used to be so common, but it's uncommon now. It used to be so common that the male population would end up getting thinned out, and there would oftentimes be more women than there were men. This is why when you listen to those subconscious developed male cucks out there who shit on polygyny and the idea of multiple wives, the only reason they can even make that argument is because that war is not as prevalent as it used to be. Because throughout history with society, there was always more women than there were men. It's also, for example, the principle behind true religion is taking care of widows and orphans, because war oftentimes leads to widows and orphans. And then men would have the opportunity, the UD men that would come back surviving war, they'd have the opportunity to take on more women. The problem is that due to the Catholic Church and some guy named Saint Pius, he doesn't really sound like a saint, he's more of like Saint Cuck, let's be honest. This guy decided that monogamy was the way, and then the church, with their Malthusianism, just decided to go from that direction and run towards monogamy, even though monogamy is actually against God and against God's teachings. But whatever, the church is just, fucking stupid. But be that as it may, man would go off to war. Now here's the thing, what happens when you have a subconscious developed male and he ends up drafted or conscripted and he ends up going to war, but his woman is subconscious developed, right? So let's imagine right now that the Russians are going to be invading the Balkans, including Poland, and the reason why they would do that is because Ukraine has been launching drone strikes from those territories directly into Russia, basically. And it's almost as if the Ukrainian allies are assisting Ukraine in doing attacks in Russia. Therefore, Russia would be technically justified in attacking those other nations. And let's say that actually happens. And let's say that escalates. And let's say that leads to World War III. Then all of a sudden there's a draft. And all these young men in the United States of America, these subconscious developed men in the United States of America, basically end up conscripted, they end up drafted, right? These weak, subconscious developed male cucks, and they end up getting shipped off to war. Already, they're learning the first lesson of the rite of passage. Society and your family will sell you out. And they will put your life on the line, and they will not give you a choice, and you will suffer. And it's up to you, and only you, to ensure your own survival on the battlefield. Because otherwise, you're going to die. So, subconscious development, as we've explained, where these men have these neural pathways because they've been so babied and underfathered and overmothered. I'm quoting Pastor Mark Driscoll when I say that. Like, these men, they go off to war, and they're all about sensing danger, and it's just basically sending a bunch of non-confrontational men to the front lines. I wonder how many of them are going to survive. I would say not very many. It's pretty sad, but that's what happens when you're overmothered and underfathered. That's what happens when you're raised by single moms. That's what happens when mothers initiate divorce on their husbands, and then literally create fatherlessness. Women are the #1 creators of fatherlessness, not men. A lot of people don't understand that. At least they create it through action. But in terms of intent, it's actually the men who do it, because of their stupid intentions that they don't even realize that they're not fathering their children appropriately, much less taking responsibility for the health and well-being of their children. And that's a big problem. So, as a result, people need to be aware of this. People need to be, they need to understand the importance of war and what it does. But it can also lead to some really bad consequences. Because for one, when you send off a subconscious developed male to war, it is not likely he is going to survive. It is not likely. When you send a worker ant to war, he's not going to survive. The soldier ant will. However, there are some worker ants that when they go off to war, they actually become soldier ants. Because if they're consistently dealing with battlefield combat, their neural pathways will rapidly right themselves because they're in a hostile environment, consistently within a hostile environment. Their neural pathways will right themselves, psychologically speaking, and create unconscious development, right? I have a theory. My theory is that men who have the highest levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as shell shock, as a result of war, were the men who went to war, subconscious developed, and then came back unconscious developed. But that's just a theory. So, but the point is that if the subconscious developed male ends up surviving the war and he comes home, he will be unconscious developed. Because his brain would have been forced to go through all of the rites of passage and end up gaining the epiphanies of no one's coming to save me. Society is going to sell me downriver. My family is going to sell me downriver. It's only up to me. I was born alone and I'm going to die alone. These epiphanies, where the man realizes he has absolutely zero safety net and he has to be his own safety net and become the safety net for others on the battlefield, because it's the only way they are all going to survive the war. And then he comes home and he's unconscious developed because he's had these epiphanies. But here's the problem. What happens when he was married to a subconscious developed woman? And he comes home to a subconscious developed woman and her stupid, nagging, masculine behavior. When then he left effeminate and he came back masculine, what do you think is going to happen? Well, their marriage is going to fall apart. Their marriage is absolutely going to fall apart because what had happened is that they are no longer compatible. See, a lot of people don't realize the importance of the octagram. The octagram is critical in knowing for personality typing. It's not just good enough to say, oh, these types are compatible with these types. No, it's type plus octagram. You need to know which of the 16 types you are. You need to know which of the 8 octagrams you are, okay? And you pick your person, your wife or your husband, based on compatibility from that point of view. Because, like, for example, you could have a golden pair. Let's say you have an ISFJ with an ESFP, and they're both subconscious developed. The ISFJ, who's SD, he ends up going to war, and he leaves with like a fun complex because he's got fun complex, and then he comes back with a God complex, for example. Like, the point is that because his octagram has changed, because he went from being SD to UD, and he's UD, often due to the PTSD, etc., and the influences of war, what's going to happen is that their marriage, doesn't matter that they were golden pairs, their marriage is no longer compatible. And at that point, his brain and her brain are literally competing for the same space in the relationship, and it's going to lead to endless conflict. And then he's going to start feeling like, well, shit, I didn't fight all this war. I didn't put my life on the line for fucking nothing. Holy fucking shit, right? And that's the problem. That's the problem. And this happens consistently. I actually go into detail about this on season 42. It's my paid compatibility course, going in deep in compatibility. There's 20 episodes devoted to it. It's at school.com/csjoseph, SKOOL.com/csjoseph. Purchase access to season 42 or upgrade to premium, so then you just get it included with your premium membership, and then you're good to go. You could just start watching it. And those episodes were just completed, season 42. All of it is completed, including the finale, which the finale was excellent. And there you go. You can check it out. You can learn all about compatibility. And I explain in the first 5 episodes exactly this phenomenon that ends up happening, right? So if you want to learn more about this phenomenon, you should definitely go get the course and get educated. Be that as it may. There's even worse consequences when you actually think about the socio-political dynamics and how they impact, and geopolitical dynamics and how they impact the psychological dynamics of individuals and families. So for example, right, SD male goes off to war. Well, subconscious developed women are more likely to cheat. So it's possible he went off to war, but then she started cheating with some other SD male loser who was not drafted and was readily available at the time, because he still has his safety nets, and he's, monkey branching from safety net to safety net, and he couldn't monkey branch, and he was able to monkey branch to his safety net instead of being drafted in the war, basically, because he's a coward. And then the SD woman, who was the wife of the SD man who ended up in war, ends up cheating on him with that other man who has a safety net. And what if she gets pregnant or whatever? But it doesn't matter. It still fucking happened, right? And she cheats. It's actually a movie called Jarhead where you actually can see that happening in the film. It's really fucked up, but it's more common than you realize. A lot more common, to the point where it's degenerate and disgusting that this even happens. But it does. That's the problem. So, as a result, these guys, they go off to war, they come back UD, they're not even compatible with the women that they were with anymore, not even remotely. They're not even compatible with them. And then it's likely that she actually ended up cheating on him while he was gone, which is also really, really fucked up. By the way, unconscious developed women, in general, are far more loyal than subconscious developed women. It's because subconscious developed women are constantly starving for attention because they were raised in isolation and they didn't have enough attention from dad. That's a serious problem. UD girls don't really have that problem. They are not as starving for attention like SD women. That's why SD women statistically wear more makeup than the UD women. Pay attention, folks. This is reality, okay? So as a result of this, the sexual dynamics end up becoming very abusive. The man goes off to war, is in that horrible environment, comes back, and then to another horrible home environment. It's conflict, conflict, conflict. She likely cheated on him. Really bad situation, right? For this veteran to come in. And you wonder why veteran suicide is actually so high. I mean, here I am, filming this on the 4th of July, talking about, the cost of independence in the family and at home, because these men are going off to war only to come back and basically having nothing. Well, here's another way of looking at it. What happens every time a war happens? A baby boom. Humans start having more babies. Women start having more children because of war. It's just what they do, biologically. And World War I happened, the bloodiest war in human history, and the men come back. Alcohol is illegal all of a sudden because the SD women were basically running the country at the time. Idiots. And then the idiots are the men who let them do it. They come back and alcohol is illegal, and then they have all these children, and they don't really want their children to go into war again. Well, there's another war coming 15 years later, just about. But there's children born, and those children, because what happens is that oftentimes war happens, and then they don't want their children to go to war. They don't want their children to experience what they did. So they raise them really SD. It's a lot of SD children. So by the time World War II comes around, the men being shipped off to World War II, a lot of them were SD. Even though UD men were kind of the majority, a lot of them were SD. And then they end up coming home to this situation. Sure, there's this huge economic boom that led to the 1950s, which is the zenith of American society. A man could afford a home, a wife, a child, and a car on just his mediocre job, right? But then that led to the boomers, subconscious developed. See, that's the thing. You have the silent generation, you have the greatest generation, but there's a problem in there. The problem is that there's still a bunch of SD people in those situations. So you have to be aware of this. You got to understand, like, this is what veterans end up going through, and no one fucking understands this. They go off to war, and then they come back home for nothing. They come back home to just as hostile environment to them. They're carrying the abuse of PTSD and dealing with that pain everywhere they go, right? But then at the same time, you know, they come back, alcohol's illegal, their women are terrible because they're war hardened. They're war heroes, basically. What do they get out of it? They get nothing. They just get shat on, continue to be shat on. That's why being a veteran is just not really respected, and it should be. It's really fucking terrible that this even happens. To the point where it's like, honestly, it's incredibly disgusting how these people are treated by this society. It's really disgusting, especially when, you know, a lot of women are working these days, but statistically, women are not paying taxes compared to men. And then as a result of that, but the men are the ones fighting the wars, but they're not the ones working as much as women are anymore. So then the veterans are not having the financial support that they should get, you know, especially through veteran affairs, etc. And that too is a bad consequence for veterans. Again, it's disgusting. This culture is disgusting. So, and it just leads to fatherlessness. That's like the ultimate, it's like the ultimate thing. It's just more fatherlessness, endless fatherlessness everywhere you go. Because again, these people are not in compatible relationships when they come home. And this ends up leading to feminism. Why? Because for a long time in the 1900s, unconscious developed men were they used as the scapegoat from which family law was derived. They are used as the scapegoat. They're the scapegoat of society, unconscious developed men. You know, they're the ones who won the war. They're used as the scapegoat of society. You know, they're the ones carrying the most pain. They're the ones who are suffering the most. But they're used as the scapegoat of society. And they ended up being blamed. Oh, you know, he's shit. You know, these men are horrible fathers. You know, oh, I need to divorce him. I need to divorce him. And then society bought that lie. Society bought the lie that the unconscious developed men were responsible for fatherlessness in the 1900s. When the reality situation is, it's actually the women acting out because their men were no longer compatible with them when they came back from war, because there was a high amount of subconscious developed populace. And since World War I, the subconscious developed populace has actually increased generation after generation after generation, to the point now where it's 80%. To the point now where family law is structured with the assumption that unconscious developed men are actually the problem. When the reality of the situation is, it's actually the subconscious developed women who are the problem. And this continues to perpetuate day after day, and it's created an endless cycle of fatherlessness within the United States of America and ultimately Western society, to the point that we continue to have people underfathered and overmothered. See, if they were properly fathered, women would have all the attention in the world, such that they're trying to avoid getting more attention when they're older. And then obviously makeup sales would be low. That's one point. Or look at the men. If they were properly fathered, they would realize that they would have to earn attention and be somewhat raised in isolation as their father prepares them to be able to have the epiphanies required to pass the rite of passage and ultimately survive in a war. More soldier ants. But no, we have a nation of workers, you know, according to Rockefeller, not a nation of thinkers. Thinkers come from unconscious developed judging males, the top 4% of the populace right now. And a lot of people don't even realize how the Octagram literally it changes people over time and how people change. And it's because of environmental changes. Women are not made to change from environment to environment, but they are made to change and adapt to changes within their own environment. Men, it's the opposite. They don't adapt well to changes within their own environment, but they do adapt well to changing environments, meaning going from one environment to another. That's why we fight the wars. That's why we are the disposable sex. It's literally for that reason. It's cognitive development versus cognitive focus. But you folks should probably figure that the fuck out, because you have all these huge societal problems as a result. My point is, you know, you look at veterans, a lot of veterans you see out there, very unconscious developed, especially the older ones, especially the ones that fought in Vietnam. Go be there for those people, because they got fucked over. And then they got blamed for society. You know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And veterans is no different. They just got shat on by society. And it's completely unfair to them. Completely unfair. And because that subconscious development ends up taking over, feminism ends up taking over, society blamed them, even though they weren't actually the problem. The problem is that their men did not teach them, their fathers did not teach them what they needed to be unconscious developed. You know, there's an example of this from the Bible, from the book of Jonah. Jonah went to Nineveh, they all repented, and then within one generation they were still wiped out anyway. Why? Because they did not teach their children. They needed to be unconscious developed, because unconscious development is necessary for people to be more reliant on God instead of society. Subconscious developed people are very reliant on society and often commit idolatry with society, and they are not reliant on God. This happens over and over and over, and many people are not even aware that this phenomenon is actually a thing. So there you go. So in order to do it, you know, if you're a man, get UD as soon as possible. Become unconscious developed as soon as possible. And then teach your sons to be unconscious development. That is absolutely critical. Avoid teaching your daughters subconscious development. They should not have to earn your attention. They should just get your attention just for the sake of being. Because mothers are supposed to teach their children that they have value just for being. Fathers teach their children that they have value based on doing. The problem is that because of subconscious developed society, both parents are trying to teach daughters that it's about what they do instead of who they are. That's a big fucking problem. Very huge problem. So, as a result, we need to take responsibility as parents, because society is not going to change until the parenting changes. And that's the point. But hey, you know, if you're a man and you're not UD yet and you become UD, I think you should just avoid subconscious developed women in general. Just avoid them. Stay away from them. Don't have anything to do with them. You know, only go for the unconscious developed women. But the problem is like right now within society, the women who are unconscious developed, they're younger. They're not corrupted by society. They're not corrupted by life like the subconscious developed ones are. And that's why the SD women fucking hate the UD women, because they all are treating the UD women like they're pick-me's, even though they secretly wished they had what the UD women have. Pay attention, folks. There are consequences to all of our behavior. Not just micro consequences, but macro consequences, as this video is going and is attempting to teach you folks. Anyway, thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you guys on the next episode.